There are spies who live in the shadows, and then there are spies who never needed to hide. Anthony Blunt did not break into offices at night. He did not flee across borders. He did not live under false names. Instead, he walked openly through the highest institutions of Britain, trusted, respected, and quietly untouchable.
He worked inside MI5. He advised the British royal family. He curated the King's art collection. He moved through palaces, universities, and intelligence headquarters with confidence because he knew no one would ever question him. And for decades, no one did. That is what made him dangerous.
Espionage at its highest level is not about disguises or gadgets. It is about blending so perfectly into power that suspicion never forms. The greatest spies are not discovered because they never look like spies at all. Anthony Blunt was the perfect example. Born into privilege, educated at Cambridge, and connected by blood to the British royal family, Blunt represented everything Britain trusted about itself. He was cultivated, articulate, and brilliant.
A polymath fluent in languages, a scholar whose authority in art history was internationally respected. From the outside, his life appeared almost predestined. This was a man meant to serve the state, meant to safeguard culture, meant to belong at the center of British society. But beneath that surface, another allegiance was forming, and it began long before the war.
The Britain Blunt grew up in was deeply hierarchical. Class mattered, background mattered, and loyalty to tradition was expected, not debated. Yet by the 1930s, cracks were appearing everywhere. The Great Depression had shaken faith in capitalism. Fascism was rising across Europe. Spain was burning. Germany was transforming into something terrifying. For many young intellectuals, especially those inside elite universities, the old order no longer felt moral. It felt brittle, hypocritical, out of touch.
Cambridge University became a pressure cooker for ideas, for ideology, for belief. And Anthony Blunt stood right at the center of it. He was not a revolutionary in the streets. He was a revolutionary in conversation, in reading groups, in late-night debates among students who believed history was bending towards something new and that they had a responsibility to help push it. Communism, to them, did not look like tyranny. It looked like justice, like rational order, like an antidote to fascism.
For Blunt, the attraction went even deeper. He was a homosexual in a country where homosexuality was illegal. That fact alone placed him permanently at odds with the British state. The same establishment that praised him publicly could destroy him privately if it chose to. That contradiction mattered. It created distance, resentment, and eventually justification. If the system did not fully accept him, why should he fully accept the system? By the early 1930s, Blunt had already crossed an invisible line. He was no longer just sympathetic to Marxist ideas. He was committed to them. And someone was watching.
Soviet intelligence understood Cambridge very well. They knew where Britain's future administrators, diplomats, and intelligence officers were being formed. They knew which minds were ambitious, which were idealistic, and which were quietly angry. Recruitment did not happen in dark alleys. It happened over conversations, over shared outrage, over belief. Blunt was approached carefully, patiently, not as a spy, but as a thinker.
By the time the formal offer came, the decision had already been made. Anthony Blunt agreed to work for Soviet intelligence. At first, his role was modest. He would identify others, talented students, politically aligned, well-connected,
Men who could someday reach the same heights he expected to reach himself. This was not espionage in the traditional sense. It was investment. The Soviet Union was not buying secrets yet. It was planting futures.
Và Blunt was extraordinarily good at it. The group that emerged from this effort would later become known as the Cambridge Five. They would penetrate MI5, MI6, the Foreign Office, even Britain's most sensitive wartime intelligence operations. But at this stage, none of that had happened yet. What mattered was that Blunt had become something far more dangerous than a spy. He had become invisible.
When war finally came in 1939, Britain's intelligence services expanded rapidly. There was urgency, fear, very little vetting. Old assumptions filled the gaps. If you came from the right school, had the right accent, and knew the right people, you were assumed to be safe. Anthony Blunt fit perfectly. Despite his known communist sympathies, he was brought into military intelligence. Connections smoothed the way. Reputations reassured doubts. Within months, he was inside the system he had quietly committed himself to undermining.
And the deeper he went, the safer he became. Because the higher Blunt climbed, the harder it became to imagine that someone like him could ever be a traitor. This is the paradox that defined his career. He was not reckless. He was methodical. He did not rush to steal secrets. He positioned himself where secrets would come to him naturally. And soon, they did. By the early years of World War II, Anthony Blunt was no longer just a Soviet asset in waiting. He was active, trusted, and gaining access to information that could alter the course of the war. At the same time, his public life flourished. He continued his work as an art historian. He lectured. He published. He built a reputation that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with culture and intellect. This dual existence was not an accident. It was strategy.
Art provided legitimacy. Scholarship provided cover. Respectability provided protection. And no one understood that better than Blunt himself. Yet there was a deeper question still unresolved. Blunt did not see himself as betraying Britain. He believed he was serving a higher historical truth, that communism, not liberal democracy, was the future, and that the suffering of the present was justified by the justice of what would come next. It was a belief that allowed extraordinary compromises and eventually extraordinary damage. Because once a man convinces himself that history is on his side, almost anything becomes permissible.
By the time Britain realized the scale of Soviet penetration, Anthony Blunt was already too deeply embedded to remove. And by the time his name would finally be spoken aloud in public, the war had long ended, the Cold War had begun, and the consequences of his actions had already reshaped the world. But this is only the beginning, because there is a darker question still waiting. Was Anthony Blunt merely a loyal servant of Moscow, or was he playing a far more dangerous game, one that may have cost thousands of lives and altered the balance of power in Europe forever? That answer does not begin in a battlefield. It begins inside MI5.
Before Anthony Blunt ever handled classified files, before he walked the corridors of MI5, before his name became associated with treachery, there was Cambridge. Not the Cambridge of postcards and traditions, but the Cambridge of the early 1930s, a place where old certainties were collapsing and new convictions were forming with dangerous intensity. To understand how Blunt became a spy, you first have to understand why Cambridge mattered so much to Soviet intelligence.
Cambridge was not just a university. It was a factory for Britain's future ruling class. Civil servants, diplomats, intelligence officers, men who would one day occupy positions where decisions were made quietly and consequences unfolded globally. And in the aftermath of the First World War, many of those young men were disillusioned. They had grown up hearing promises about honor and empire, only to watch Europe tear itself apart. They entered adulthood during economic collapse. They watched fascism rise in Germany and Italy, while democratic governments appeared slow, divided, and weak. For a certain kind of mind, communism offered clarity. It claimed to explain history. It promised inevitability. It framed suffering not as failure, but as transition.
At Cambridge, these ideas did not circulate on pamphlets alone. They lived in conversations, in dining halls, in private rooms late at night, where students argued not about whether change was coming, but about how fast it should be pushed. Anthony Blunt thrived in this environment. He was intellectually agile, comfortable with abstraction, at ease discussing philosophy, art, politics, and history in the same breath. He joined the Cambridge Apostles, an elite and secretive discussion society whose members believed ideas mattered because ideas shaped the world. Inside that circle, radical thinking was not marginal, it was prestigious. Blunt's Marxism did not make him an outsider, it made him interesting. He was not shouting slogans, he was articulating a worldview, one that framed capitalism as morally exhausted and fascism as its final, desperate mutation.
In this intellectual climate, the Soviet Union did not appear as a dictatorship. It appeared as an experiment, a flawed one perhaps, but one moving in the right historical direction. This is where Soviet intelligence was patient. The NKVD did not demand loyalty overnight. They did not recruit spies by force. They identified belief, then nurtured it. Blunt's first contact was subtle. There was no dramatic pitch, no immediate talk of espionage. Instead, there were conversations, shared concerns, agreement on first principles. Only later came the question that mattered. Would he be willing to help?
At this stage, helping did not mean stealing documents. It meant observing, assessing, recommending. Blunt was asked to identify other students who shared his convictions, who were intelligent, discreet, well-connected. This suited him perfectly. He did not have to break with his public life. He did not have to live a double existence yet. He was simply extending conversations he was already having, and he was extraordinarily effective. Through Blunt, Soviet intelligence gained access not to secrets, but to potential. Among those he helped bring into the fold were men who would later become legendary: Guy Burgess, Kim Philby, Donald MacLean, John Cancross. They were not recruited because they were reckless. They were recruited because they were plausible. They looked like the future of Britain, and in many ways they were.
There has been long debate about who recruited whom. Blunt later claimed that Burgess, with his charm and recklessness, had drawn him in. Others argue the opposite. What matters more than the order is the structure that formed. This was not a loose collection of sympathizers. It was a network, built deliberately, designed to last. Sexuality also played a role, though not in the simplistic way often portrayed. Several members of the group were homosexual in a society that criminalized them. This created shared vulnerability, mutual silence, and leverage. It also reinforced a sense of separation from the state, a belief that loyalty to Britain was conditional, because Britain's loyalty to them certainly was.
For Blunt, this reinforced his moral framework. The state was not neutral. It enforced hypocrisy. It demanded obedience while offering conditional acceptance. Communism, by contrast, presented itself as universal, impersonal, inevitable, and inevitability is seductive. By the time Blunt completed his studies, his path was already set, not because he was forced into it, but because he believed in it. He chose not to join the Communist Party publicly. That decision was calculated. Party membership would close doors, discretion would open them.
This distinction mattered. Blunt did not see himself as a revolutionary. He saw himself as a custodian of history's direction. That self-image would allow him to justify choices that others would later struggle to comprehend. As Europe moved closer to war, the men Blunt helped recruit began drifting into precisely the institutions Soviet intelligence had hoped for: the Foreign Office, MI6, code-breaking units, security services. What had begun as ideological conversation was now becoming operational reality. And Blunt himself, armed with academic prestige and social connections, was positioning himself for the same ascent. When war finally erupted, the network was already in place. They did not scramble to react, they waited. Because the most dangerous spies are not those who rush into action. They are the ones who are already exactly where they need to be when history accelerates. And when Britain began recruiting in haste, assuming loyalty based on accent and pedigree, Anthony Blunt stepped forward, not as a suspect, but as a solution.
In the next phase of his life, he would no longer be planting seeds, he would be harvesting them. And the information that passed through his hands would soon reach the very heart of Britain's war effort. When Britain went to war, it did not have the luxury of caution. Intelligence services expanded almost overnight. Offices multiplied, departments were reorganized, and standards that would once have taken years to satisfy were now waived in weeks. The assumption was simple: the enemy was outside. The danger came from bombs, submarines, and saboteurs, not from men who spoke well, came from the right background, and looked exactly like the kind of people Britain trusted. Anthony Blunt entered MI5 at precisely the right moment. He did not arrive as an obvious candidate for counterintelligence. In fact, his earlier communist sympathies had already raised eyebrows. But wartime Britain was pragmatic. If a man was anti-fascist, well-connected, and useful, that was often enough. Blunt was all three. Through personal recommendation and institutional inertia, he was brought into military intelligence and soon found his way into MI5 itself. At first, his role seemed unremarkable.
Administrative, analytical. The kind of work that rewarded intelligence and patience rather than heroics. But Blunt understood something crucial. In intelligence, power does not come from proximity to action. It comes from proximity to information. And information, in wartime Britain, flowed through channels that were far more mundane than people imagined.
Letters, cables, diplomatic correspondence. Conversations assumed to be private because protocol said they should be. This is where Blunt thrived. He was assigned to work that involved monitoring foreign diplomatic missions based in Britain. Countries officially neutral, but quietly suspected of acting as conduits for German intelligence. Spain, Portugal, Sweden. These embassies exchanged vast quantities of information. Courier bags moved constantly through ports and airports, protected by diplomatic convention. They were not supposed to be touched. That assumption was their weakness. Blunt became deeply involved in an operation known as Triplex. Its purpose was audacious, illegal, and extraordinarily effective. MI5 sought to intercept diplomatic bags as they traveled in and out of the country, not to seize them, but to copy them, photograph them, return them without leaving a trace. Couriers were delayed, flights were quietly rescheduled, port officials were persuaded to cooperate. The bags were opened in secret, their contents removed, copied meticulously, then resealed so perfectly that no one suspected a thing.
To MI5, this operation was a triumph. Sensitive communications, intelligence reports, personal correspondence, all flowing into British hands without resistance. What MI5 did not fully grasp was that this river of information had developed a tributary. Everything Blunt saw, Everything he supervised, everything he signed off on, was duplicated once more, this time for Moscow. Blunt did not need to steal documents. He did not need to sneak papers out of safes. The system delivered them to him. Triplex made him invaluable, efficient, discreet, organizationally brilliant. He built networks of cooperation across ports, post offices, and embassies. Men trusted him because he appeared calm, professional, and entirely devoted to his work.
As a result, his access expanded. Soon, Blunt was not just handling intercepted correspondence, he was shaping how intelligence was processed, what was prioritized, what was circulated, and what quietly went nowhere. At the same time, his position within MI5 improved dramatically. He was transferred into counter-espionage, the very heart of the service, the place where moles were supposed to be detected, not created. This was no coincidence. Blunt was intelligent, but more importantly, he was reassuring. Senior officers saw him as safe, reliable, a man whose background and demeanor made betrayal seem almost absurd. One of them took him on as a personal assistant, a role that placed Blunt closer to sensitive material than most field officers would ever get. From that point on, he was inside the bloodstream of British intelligence. Information did not pass through layers before reaching him. It arrived directly.
And the volume was staggering. Reports from embassies, assessments of German intelligence operations, intercepted communications, internal debates about strategy and security. Between 1941 and 1945, Blunt would pass thousands of documents to Soviet intelligence, not in dramatic handoffs, but through routine, methodical transmission. It was not flashy espionage. It was devastating espionage. The Soviet Union received a near continuous stream of British intelligence assessments, not filtered, not delayed, but current. And the deeper he embedded himself, the less likely anyone was to question him. There was an additional irony. Blunt was officially tasked with monitoring foreign nationals and diplomatic staff. He tracked movements, noted associations, flagged suspicious behavior. In theory, he was hunting spies. In practice, he was ensuring that his own activities and those of his network remained invisible. This is where the structure of wartime intelligence worked in his favor. MI5 was overstretched, understaffed, focused outward. Trust was assumed unless disproven, and disproving trust required evidence. Blunt left none.
He did not behave erratically. He did not flaunt ideology. He did not push policy. He blended. By the time senior figures began to realize the scale of Soviet penetration elsewhere, Anthony Blunt was already indispensable. Removing him would have meant admitting that the system itself had failed, so no one tried. By 1943, Blunt had become one of the best-informed men inside British counterintelligence, and soon he would be placed somewhere even more dangerous, a position that granted access not just to intelligence reports, but to the operational plans that would determine the outcome of the war. Because the greatest damage was still to come, and it would not happen in London. It would happen in Europe. By 1940, the war had entered a different phase. Britain was no longer fighting for survival. It was preparing for victory. That transition changed everything. Intelligence was no longer just about defense. It was about timing, deception, and coordination on a scale never attempted before. This was the moment when information became more dangerous than bombs, and Anthony Blunt was placed exactly where that information converged. In mid-1945, Blunt was appointed as an MI5 liaison to the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the Allied High Command responsible for planning the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. This was not a ceremonial role, it was operational. From this position, Blunt gained access to the most closely guarded intelligence in the Allied arsenal, Ultra.
UNCHA was not a single source. It was a system. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had succeeded in decrypting vast quantities of German military communications, radio traffic, operational orders, strategic assessments. UNCHA allowed the Allies to see what the German High Command believed, feared, and planned. It was the crown jewel of British intelligence. Its existence was concealed even from close allies, and Anthony Blunt could see it. He was not decrypting messages himself. He did not sit among mathematicians and cryptanalysts, but the product of their work flowed upward into summaries, assessments, briefings, and from there onto Blunt's desk. At the same time, the Allies were preparing the most complex deception campaign in military history, Operation Fortitude.
The goal was simple in theory and monumental in execution. Convince Adolf Hitler that the Allied invasion of Western Europe would land at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. To achieve this, the Allies created an entire phantom army. Fake units, false radio traffic, dummy equipment, carefully leaked intelligence. Everything was designed to reinforce one belief, that Normandy was a diversion. Fortitude depended on secrecy, timing, and absolute discipline. And it depended on Ultra remaining uncompromised. Blunt was involved in this process. He saw the intelligence assessments, the intercepted German reactions, the feedback loops that confirmed the deception was working. And he passed it on to Moscow. From the Soviet perspective, this intelligence was invaluable. The USSR was fighting a brutal war on the Eastern Front. Every insight into German deployments, intentions, and miscalculations mattered. Blunt supplied it, document after document, summary after summary. Between 1941 and 1945, he transmitted well over 1,000 intelligence reports. Yet here is the paradox. Despite his access, despite his ideological commitment, despite his proven willingness to betray British secrets, the Normandy invasion was not compromised. The Germans were surprised. The landings succeeded. The Western Front was opened. This raises a question that has troubled historians for decades. Why? Why did Blunt pass so much information, yet allow the most critical operation of the war to proceed unhindered? The answer lies not in loyalty to Britain, but in alignment of interests. For the Soviet Union, a second front in Western Europe was essential. It relieved pressure on Soviet forces. It accelerated Germany's defeat. Allowing Normandy to succeed served Moscow's goals.
Blunt did not act randomly. He did not betray everything equally. He filtered. What he passed on, while what he did not, reflected a strategic logic. This was not emotional espionage. It was calculated. The same logic applied to Fortitude. The deception misled Germany, but it did not harm Soviet interests. On the contrary, it helped draw German forces away from the East. So Blunt let it stand. This distinction matters because it reveals something crucial about how he operated. He was not simply leaking secrets, he was shaping outcomes, and that is a far more dangerous role. By late 1943 and early 1944, Blunt was at the peak of his influence. He had access to Ultra, he had access to invasion planning, he had access to diplomatic intelligence from across Europe, and he had the trust of men who believed they were fighting a clean war against a clear enemy. But the line Blunt refused to cross at Normandy would soon be crossed elsewhere, because there was another operation, another moment where interests diverged, an operation whose failure would reshape Europe for decades to come, and this time the consequences aligned differently. The operation was called Market Garden.
And it would become one of the most controversial episodes of the Second World War. That is where the story turns darker.
Operation Market Garden was conceived as a shortcut to victory. By late summer 1944, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy. German defenses in France were collapsing. Momentum was on the Allies' side. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery believed the war could be ended before Christmas. The plan was bold, reckless, some would later say. Airborne troops would be dropped deep behind enemy lines in the Netherlands. They would seize a chain of bridges. Armored units would race up a narrow corridor to meet them. If it worked, the Allies would bypass Germany's strongest defenses and surge straight into the industrial heart of the Reich. It was an all-or-nothing gamble, and it failed. Spectacularly. Tens of thousands of Allied troops were killed, wounded, or captured. The advance stalled. The war dragged on, and the Soviet army, advancing relentlessly from the east, would eventually reach Berlin first. For decades, historians debated why Market Garden collapsed. Some blamed optimism, some blamed logistics, some blamed bad weather. But there was another possibility, that the Germans knew it was coming.
During the war, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park began intercepting German communications that hinted at unusually precise foreknowledge, warnings that went beyond luck or guesswork. The intelligence was signed with a single name, Josephine.
To German intelligence, Josephine was a prized source. Her reports were described by British analysts as the most damaging intelligence leak of the entire war. She seemed to know everything: operational plans, timetables, unit dispositions, information that could only have come from the highest levels of Allied planning. British intelligence was alarmed. They assigned a senior MI5 officer to identify the mole. That officer was Anthony Blunt. This is where the story takes on a disturbing symmetry. Blunt, already known privately to be a Soviet agent by later evidence, was now tasked with hunting a source who appeared to be feeding intelligence to Nazi Germany. Officially, Blunt began investigating. Unofficially, questions remain about what he truly did. MI6, operating independently, made a breakthrough in Stockholm. They identified Josephine's German handler, a lawyer named Karl-Heinz Kramer, operating out of the German embassy. Through careful surveillance and human recruitment, British intelligence gained access to Kramer's safe. Inside were documents of staggering sensitivity. They revealed Allied plans with a level of detail that shocked even experienced intelligence officers.
Peter Fleming, the MI6 officer involved, returned to London and met Blunt to share the findings. Accounts of that meeting are chilling. Blunt reportedly dismissed the documents as forgeries, then grew angry, then insisted there was no possibility of a high-level leak to the Soviets or the Germans. He took the documents with him, promised to investigate, and never formally reported back. Instead, a scapegoat was produced, a Swedish diplomat, arrested, questioned. But the intelligence leaks did not stop, which raises the most dangerous hypothesis in the entire Blunt story, that Anthony Blunt was not merely passing intelligence to Moscow, that he may also have been the source feeding Germany, that he was Josephine. This theory, advanced by later researchers, does not claim Blunt was a Nazi sympathizer. Far from it. It argues something colder, that by sabotaging Market Garden, Blunt advanced Soviet strategic interests. If the Allies failed in the West, the Red Army would reach Berlin first. Eastern Europe would fall under Soviet influence. The post-war balance of power would tilt decisively. From that perspective, Market Garden was not a mistake, it was an opportunity.
This would explain the apparent contradiction in Blunt's behavior, why he allowed Normandy to succeed, why he did not compromise fortitude, why he did not sabotage the opening of the Western Front, because those outcomes helped the Soviet Union. Market Garden did not, and so, according to this interpretation, it had to fail. There is no smoking gun, no confession, no document bearing Blunt's signature. British intelligence itself remains divided. Some dismissed Josephine as a composite source. Others believe she was real, but not Blunt. Yet the circumstantial alignment is unsettling. Blunt had access, Blunt had motive, Blunt controlled the investigation, and the consequences of Market Garden reshaped Europe for generations. The Iron Curtain would descend not because of ideology alone, but because of where armies stopped and started. By the time the war ended, Stalin's troops were in Berlin, Western forces were not, and Anthony Blunt, the man who may have influenced that outcome, emerged from the war not disgraced, but rewarded, knighted,